Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. We want to thank you for joining us today for the Meaningful Voices Book Club. We're delighted you're here. We're going to get started in just a moment, but first I want to give you some technical information to help you participate in the book club discussion. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. We would love to have your questions and your feedback and comments. You can do that by clicking the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen, which will open up the question box feature. So you can send your questions at any time, and I will forward them on to our discussants. So please do that. Let's see. What else do I need to tell you? If you're having problems hearing, please exit the webinar and then reconnect using the link that was in your email. Usually that clears up any technical problems that are going on. So I want to turn this over to Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune, who is the founder and senior analyst of Faith Trust Institute, and she's going to introduce all of our fine, distinguished discussants tonight. Marie?
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to my fellow panelists. Particularly in issues of faith with gender-based violence. And so the purpose of the book club over the previous months and into the future is to find books that bring us together around those issues and then bring them to you in a discussion format so that we can reflect together on them. So I'm delighted to be joined tonight with the author of our book, Dr. Elizabeth Ursic. And Elizabeth is professor of religious studies at Mesa Community College in Phoenix, Arizona, and is on the board of the Parliament of World Religions. And also Reverend Dr. Kathy McCauley, who is assistant professor of ministerial leadership and ethics at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and was founding pastor of the Church of the Open Arms, also in Tulsa. And finally, Dr. Marjorie Proctor-Smith is professor, I'm thinking that's Emerita, Marjorie, of preaching and worship from SMU Perkins School of Theology, and she is a foremost scholar in Christian feminist liturgy and ritual. And I just wanted to comment that, Marjorie, I haven't seen you in a long time, but we first met at Grailville in the first seminary quarter for women in 1974, if I recall correctly. And here we are, still at it. So it's a delight to hear you tonight. Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion, I'm sure. But Marjorie is not going to be seen on our live video because she lives in the middle of nowhere and we can't access her successfully, but she's on the phone with us, so she will be fully participating in our discussion. So welcome to all of you. So let's go to the next slide, Sarah. And I want to start with Elizabeth and go back one. Thank you. I want to start with Elizabeth specifically and ask you why you undertook this project.
Marie, thank you very much. I'm just fidgeting here a little bit with the microphone and so that it doesn't fall off my head as I begin talking. So what inspired me to write the book? I have to say that I very much, when I was at Yale Divinity, was interested to know where are women in the stories. And I was there studying religion and art. So I was very much focused on how people outpictured their sense of the divine. And there was actually a art competition put out by the NCR in the year 2000, which was the year I started, on who was Jesus for the third millennium. And there were 60 images submitted, and the winning image, which was Jesus of all nations, the model for the image was an African-American woman. And when you looked at the image, there was nothing about it that said, oh, that couldn't be Jesus. But when you knew that it was an African American woman, you could see her. And that got me interested about images of God, specifically in Christian understanding. And I started to ask people as they looked at the images whether they saw male or female. Shortly after that, I met an order of Catholic nuns, the Daughters of Wisdom, and they became the second chapter in the book. And the Daughters of Wisdom explained that they prayed to Sophia as a female face of God, one of the female names of God in the Bible. And so I got very curious about this, and I was wondering why we don't see more of this in worship. And that's what began the study. So it started with my MDiv. It then became my PhD thesis, where I included 3 more Protestant groups, and that's what became the book. I was interested in looking at female imagery, specifically in worship on the altar in denominations that were recognized as being in full communion with that denomination, and led by a vowed either religious or minister who would take vows to uphold that tradition while they were doing this worship.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that sort of positions, I think, the whole project in terms of the various things that came together for you. And I appreciate the way in which you narrow focus. Did you find significant in your thinking and as you read it? Kathy, you want to start?
Sure. I've been interested in the politics of women's ordination and women's spirituality, and it's one of my research areas. So I appreciate the book because of the way it analyzes the power dynamics of who gets to make decisions about what kind of language is used in liturgy, looking at liturgical reform as a lens for exploring kind of the entrenched protection of patriarchy in churches is one of the contributions that the book makes. I assigned the book in a class that I taught this year for Doctor of Ministry students. So it was pastors who have quite a bit of experience, and we're looking particularly at intersections of racism and sexism in their own leadership experience. And the book was tremendously helpful in looking at some of that. I also attended the first Reimagining conference early in the 1990s and continued to go back and be a part of those reunions and that community. So being a part of this movement has been a central focus of my ministry.
Great, thank you. And Marjorie, what was the most significant aspect of Elizabeth's book for you?
Well, what I particularly appreciated about it is that it gives us a written, documented record of the issues of communities dealing with the issues of female language and imagery in worship. And my experience over the decades is that a lot of those kinds of events tend to take place sub rosa and tend not to be recorded or annotated or written down even in any way. And the net result of that is the loss of history, particularly of our history as feminist Christian women. So for me, because I have kind of a historical bent of mind, for me the most valuable thing is actually having these written records that decades from now, scholars will be able to pick this book up and say, this is some of what was going on. I think that's so important just for history, but it's also important for future present and future activists who want to investigate how these dynamics work, particularly in specific church-related contexts. But of course, we all know that the same dynamics are at work in lots of other institutions as well. So I think there's huge takeaways that you can get from this book. It's a wonderful book.
Well, I want to thank you both. Kathy, I was so pleased when I heard that you were using it in your classes, and I do hope that one day I can Skype in and say hello to them and hear their reactions directly. We tried it last week, this didn't work with our schedules. And Marjorie, I want to thank you very much for pointing out about the historical record. One of the reasons why I chose such a tight kind of focused sample of established denominations with worship communities that were in full communion with their denomination was because, since this is viewed in some quarters as being controversial, I knew that picking the most patriarchal location, potentially patriarchal location, for the worship would also unearth that sub rosa that you spoke about, those things that happen, generally whisper campaigns in the pews, offhanded comments to pastors as people are leaving. I can't tell you the number of female and male pastors, but more female pastors, who said that if they tried some of this language, people on their way out just made it clear that if they had anything to say about it, they wouldn't be continuing there if they continued with that language. And we're not even talking about imagery, just the language. So most of it was anecdotal, but by going to something where this was on the altar, it made everybody engage, instead of just being a reading group down the hall. And
Right.
what it resulted in was semi-public records being council meetings, church parish meetings, local denominational newsletters. And in the case of the Methodists, it went up all the way to their synod. And when a theological inquiry was called in two of the chapters, the Church of Scotland and the United Methodist one, then we had, formal councils and declarations being said afterwards, both which supported the use of this imagery, that there wasn't anything against the Bible to do this, but it went through a lot. So I picked those kinds of locations to unearth where the patriarchal flashback really is happening.
And the other thing I want to build on what both Kathy and Margie have said to appreciate is, as a scholar at this point in doing this research for your dissertation, is that you went directly to the lived experience at the grassroots. And so this, part of what I enjoyed about it was that this was in no way an esoteric discussion. It was very concrete and very familiar for those of us who participate in local churches. And I think, again, the value of that, both historically and contemporaneously, is exceptional. So I'm going to give you a shout out for that.
Thank you. Hey, if we can, Marie, I would love to, especially since Kathy has graduate students in there with her, religious studies people, which is where I did my PhD, was in religious studies, more and more ethnographic studies of communities that people are actually familiar with are becoming more and more popular. And especially American Catholic nuns have huge archives that haven't been investigated. There is so much historical material where we still have the living figures who have lived through these histories to document. So a big plug to all the graduate students out there, but there's a lot of good work to be done.
Exactly. We need more graduate students, and there's certainly no lack of material for them. So, well, let's go ahead, and I want to ask a couple of general questions before we get into the four settings that you lay out for us. Go ahead to the next slide, Sarah, just in terms of format. So we're going to be talking about, we're going to include in our discussion the issues of innovation and tradition, defense of the patriarchy, and gender equality and justice, and the resistance to that. But in general, I guess I also want to ask each of you, why is this discussion important in our faith communities at this point? my sense is that ritual in our faith communities reflects community norms and creates community norms. And I think we certainly see that in each of the stories that you tell in the 4 sections. But why now, and why have this particular conversation within our faith communities?
I think there's a couple things going on. One is that people who have written in feminist theology or have written for gender neutrality, if not more overt feminine imagery of the divine in Christian worship, this conversation is over 50 years old. I mean, when Kathy says she was at the Reimagining conference in the 90s, feminist theologians had been writing since the 70s and even earlier. So the question is, why is this still new? Why are people still surprised? And I think this idea about ritual, to me, what gets performed on the altar on a Sunday becomes what for many people in the pews is the tradition. It doesn't matter if there is a great amount of writings, even that the worship leaders and people in seminaries are reading and theologians are writing. But if the vast majority of people only see a very small sliver, I like to think of it as the franchising of the particular strand or denomination. It's what certain people at the very highest levels want the people to believe the tradition is. But I really challenge, I would say, every single major Christian denomination we have in the United States right now has a multiplicity of voices and multiple ways, a much richer way of seeing things. But if the people don't see it on a Sunday, then feminist theology, I think, could be at risk of becoming a footnote to second-wave feminism, that in 100 years people will say, well, there was a time where this was interesting. And basically the patriarchal imagery would have won. So that's why I think it's important. I do think innovation has to happen ritually on the altar in order for a new theology to become tradition. And we're at a very critical point for making that happen. I think a few things on the positive side of what's helping with this is we've seen an upsurge. I'm co-chair of the Women's Caucus at the American Academy of Religion, and we're seeing a new wave of younger feminist scholars coming to the fore in theology across denominations and across religions. And so there's an interest in this for scholars to be writing about it. And we still have the first foremothers of the movement in terms of feminist theology. So it's like we have all the actors here, and we can really do something with it if we seize this period of time.
Kathy, Marjorie, you want to jump in on why we need to have this conversation?
Well, I'll add just 2 things. I underline the growing desire for more diversity in terms of language, but also imagery. And I think that growing desire is partly the result of work that earlier feminist theologians have done. So I think some of the work that Marie, Marjorie, and others, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, Mary Daly, Rosemary Radford Ruther, I think that work is bearing fruit with more imagination about alternative ways of imaging the divine and connecting with the divine. I also think that the decline in numbers of people who are participating in at least mainline type denominations may be the result of some of the entrance protection of patriarchy in congregational life. So the concern for those who are leaving or have left the faith over feminist issues is one of the main things that drives me.
And I hear in that the concern for the folks who have left for lack of the reflection of the feminine.
Right.
Marjorie?
Well, good Lord. Because we've been talking
Interesting
about
language, Marjorie.
It was a curse. because we're still talking about this, that's why it's important to talk about this now.
Good point.
If it had happened, if it had become central, if this language had become central, if these images had become central, if women's leadership had become central, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But
Right.
that hasn't happened, and so here we are. Yes, okay, I'm a little frustrated. It's been a long time. But I do think that there are some forces that, and I think Kathy put a finger on this. There are so many who are disillusioned, disinterested, young people for whom some of these things are normal. That women should be seen as leaders, that language should be inclusive and emancipatory, and they're not even controversial for them. But these are the people that are going away, and so I think that's another impetus. I guess the arc is bending slowly towards justice, but
some days you have to wonder.
Oh, you do have to wonder. You really do. And it also, I'm thinking of right now, Marie, of one of our ongoing conversations at Grailville, which we called On or Off the Bus. Do you stay with the institution, these institutions that we're talking about here and that this study focuses so clearly on, or do you say, I can't do it anymore? And we all know people who've said that, who've said the cost is too high. And so where are the church institutions for those people? Where's the concern for them? Where's the care for them? Where's the desire to make room for them? So all of those things, I think, play into why we are still having this conversation,
Right.
and why we have to keep having it.
Right, exactly.
Never give up.
We
Resist.
Yeah, we have to keep having it until we don't need to have it any longer.
That's right.
And then we can have another conversation.
I just wanted to add something to this. One of the main points I make in the conclusion is that I think the headlines for most denominations was over women's ordination, whether you do it, whether you don't. And in all denominations, I mean, the Catholic section, the Catholics, traditional Roman Catholicism said no. The three Protestant groups said yes. But in all cases, the very next step was to control the worship. In all the cases. It was the second fire line, and that didn't receive as much attention. As a matter of fact, if anything, maybe things moved into God neutrality language so as not to offend anybody, which is an okay step, but the radical idea that everyone is made in God's image, and for Christianity, since it's so anthropomorphized with Jesus, unlike Judaism and Islam, which you don't walk in a worship space and see any anthropomorphized images there in those Abrahamic traditions, but in Christianity you do. And if you only see male-bodied, divine imagery, that just does something subliminal. And it feeds back, I think, even on that 11% that's quoted right here on this screen, that we still only have 11% of women in leadership as pastors. If that's the imagery that's surrounding everything else on the altar, I think that even sublimity feeds into who chooses to move into leadership, who are valid for top leadership. So, so that's another reason why this is important right now.
And even though, at least the last time I checked, 50% of our students in theological education are female, that figure doesn't correspond very well to this figure in terms of leadership of congregations. So there's some disconnect there as well.
Well, what it points to, Marie, is that there clearly some type of weeding out, or these kind of things that where people say there is no patriarchy anymore. There could be other factors of why women aren't leaders at a higher level, but to have it for what this slide shows, 98 to 108, 15 years, no increase of top leadership of women, that's concerning when the seminaries are 50% female. That's concerning.
Yeah, there's something wrong with this picture. So let's go to the next slide, because I want to also talk just briefly here about the, what we've been assuming that, and Elizabeth, you've articulated the importance of communal worship and what it expresses, that it does both reflect the norms of the community and shape the norms of the community. So it's a, there's a chicken and egg problem. And in terms of social change, where in that chicken and egg do we step into that cycle to have some impact? And I think one of the challenges in at least my experience in church settings is that church people seem to be genetically programmed for conflict avoidance. And so, I mean, we heard it in each of your stories in terms of some of the backlash and response. The thing that made people uncomfortable was that there was conflict in the fact that somebody was raising, the suggestion of a different image. And the problem with that is that conflict avoidance never created social change. So it seems to be part of the cultures of which we are a part in at least the Christian side of faith communities, that we tend to spend too much time at that grassroots level avoiding conflict instead of having some real direct conversations with each other about these issues. So let's go to the next slide, Sarah. And one of the reasons that I think that this is important, and several of you alluded to it, but it's really a pastoral concern. And that's part of what has disturbed me over the years, is the absence of some degree of perception and sensitivity on the part of the powers that be that again, these are not just political discussions. It's not about political correctness. There are deep pastoral needs that are not being addressed when our imagery is so narrowly defined, particularly around gender. And so at several points in your book, Elizabeth, you refer to quotes from various folks that you've worked with and so forth around gender-based violence. And since that's where I spend most of my energy focusing this conversation, it's one of my priorities to get at it. And I remember as I was reading this, I recalled when I was first in the parish that I was a young feminist pastor who really had no idea what I was doing, but there I was, and I was trying to figure out how to bring this discussion to a small rural parish, and where to begin. And I was kind of puzzling about that. And so I decided in the Bible study that we would spend 4 or 5 weeks on images of God in Scripture. And that's how it was advertised. So various images of God in Scripture. And so we got a couple weeks into it, and we're looking at some of the feminine images and so forth. And one of the oldest members of the group at that point, she was probably 80-some, and she was a farmer. And she just sat out just burst out and said, "I've never been able to think of God as my father." And I was sort of like, "Oh, good. This is going to take us somewhere that we need to go." So I said, "So, Eleanor, why is that? What does that mean to you?" And so she just proceeded to explain that her father was very cruel to her mother and to her as a child. And she knew God wasn't like that. And so she never could think of God as her father. So I asked her, "Well, how have you sat on the front row of this church, literally, for some, 80 odd years and listened to those of us standing up front using images and language about God the Father and the way we pray and we address and so forth and so on. What do you do with that? How do you process that?" And she thought for a minute and she just said, "Oh, I just don't pay any attention to any of that." And what struck me for her was how much energy she spent for all those years not paying attention in church. And however she processed it in terms of her own private prayer life and her own spirituality, she had taken care of it. She was fine. She did whatever she needed to do. Basically, her experience of father was one of abuse. And we opened no way for her to pastorally experience anything else. And so that's what I worry about in terms of kind of when the rubber hits the road in our congregations and for individuals is the negative side of their experience of violence and the absence of the positive side. So how do we as a faith community provide resources for them? So I wondered if any of you could also speak to your read of that in terms of both Elizabeth's inclusion of that, but also in your experience of addressing the pastoral side.
I've had similar experiences in congregational life as a pastor. Little girls who draw pictures of God that look like an old white man with a beard up in the sky, and when asked about alternative kinds of possibilities, are not able to imagine divine feminine because they're already saturated with cultural images by the time they're in the middle of elementary school or something like that. So the pervasiveness of these male images, even for people who aren't participating in congregations, the stories get perpetrated in a variety of ways.
It's still normative.
Yes.
In your experience.
I can echo that. I had a colleague who said that she doesn't raise. I'm at a state college, so she said, "I'm not raising my children with any religion, but my daughter came home from preschool and called God He. Where did she get that from?" And I think in what Kathy's saying, it's just the language and the culture that's sitting around you. Some of these congregations that I interviewed, younger families came mostly for their daughters so that they would see something. I actually, on one of the little blurbs, I wish I had put it in the book, just basically Christian women are told they are made in the image of God, but when do they get to see it?
Right.
I mean, that's crazy. That is like a central core thing, that we are all born, we're all one in Christ, we're all made in the image of God, according to Genesis 1, and then we never get to see it? Like, never? So I do think that there is very much a pervasiveness. I'd like to go directly to the violence issues. I found it very interesting. In my research, most of the rape imagery, and it came from a lot of fronts, was more in the 80s and 90s, as opposed to the more recent congregations that I interviewed. I think there was something about such violation that women felt, that that whole waking up to all the pieces that contributed to this sense of not being able to have voice, of not being seen fully, of sacrificing themselves for family, sacrificing their dreams, sacrificing their careers. I think there was a lot in that crucifixion image with the female. And I think that today there is still that. And I think the personal narrative that you mentioned, Marie, is very important. With the Daughters of Wisdom, it was over 100 women that were in the order, and they had been nuns for a long, long time. And they had to, after Vatican II, make sense of each other's different stories, because women were very much entrained to be identical in these orders. That was like the value of holiness, was how much you could be the same and not stand out. So after Vatican II, when they were allowed to study, when they were allowed to discern their own ministries, they found out there were differences, so how to handle the differences. And many of them, even though many of the congregation, and because they had wisdom in their title, prayed with Sophia imagery, the way that they explained the ones that did and the ones that didn't had everything to do with their family background. Not only about violence, I didn't get too many stories about direct violence, but I did get stories about whether they felt they were cared for and loved by the male parent or the female parent, and that actually drove a lot of the imagery that they wanted to see in God. So that came through very clear. And also, in the end, when I mentioned that this is not about just progressive liberal theology, that the writer of The Shack, Paul Young, growing up evangelical, the reason why he wrote The Shack with all that female imagery and it took off in evangelical circles had a lot to do with reconciling how he was abused when his parents were as missionaries, and both by the tribe they were missionizing and then later at a missionary boarding school. So, you know, it cuts through everything. And I don't want to say that if a person says that they want to see female imagery, that it says that they have that in their background. But I would say that most people that have something like that in their background and are looking for alternative imagery will have that as a strong motivation for wanting to see something like female imagery.
And the paradox is also, I think, intriguing in that is that, because I've worked with some survivors in individual conversations about this, have talked about needing the male imagery as the alternative to their experience of men who've abused them. So we can't paint this with too broad a brush in terms of people's individual experience, which I think only speaks to the importance of, you know, multiple ways of entering into an experience of spirituality and understanding who God is. Depending on your experience, but also what you do with that experience and what you need in order to heal from that experience.
Well, I think I just want to say one thing, Marie. When for the people that, I think what we need is we need to have all the options of where God is leading them in order to stay and be supported in their faith. And I've met many people that, especially with an absent or an abusive father or something, or a grandfather, to have a loving father or a loving male through Jesus as an archetype to hold that energy is amazingly healing. But to force someone and to say that's the only way that you're going to get to it, when they're ready for that, it's not what their soul is leading them towards. I'm a spiritual director, so I hear in those one-on-one conversations where people share their faith journeys with me, a lot broader range than what generally gets presented in worship or even gets taught about in Bible. God speaks to people in so many different ways, and I think we need to really listen. And as faith leaders, we need to be able to provide some reflection back, some affirmation. So if somebody's looking for alternative imagery, that they can find it. But I also want to affirm what you're saying. For many, it's incredibly healing to have something that flips the image, something else that can stand in the place where some trauma's occurred.
So, Marjorie, I'm curious, in your teaching, particularly back in the 80s, did you teach the female crucifix image or address it in your teaching? And if so, what was the response?
I'm afraid that we might have lost Marjorie.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, she's looking. She has gone. She's italicized, which I think means that she may not be on right now.
Okay, we'll wait until she comes back.
Well, Marie, I'm happy to share something while we wait for Marjorie.
Please.
Over spring break last winter, well, it was just a month or two ago, I flew into New York City for the UN CSW, Commission on the Status of Women.
Right.
And I was going to be attending a meeting there. And I had the weekend before, and I was so pleased that the Christa statue, that female imagery on
Christa,
the crucifix, which created a controversy at St. John the Divine Cathedral in the 1970s and was taken down 11 days after it had been put up, had finally been installed permanently there at the cathedral.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that.
Yes, it received its permanent installation back in October, and for 6 months they had they called it the Christa Project, where they invited, I believe, 20 other contemporary artists who were expressing images of the divine or Jesus in conversation with gender, along with race and all those issues. And it was fascinating. The exhibit was just eye-opening on many levels. It was exciting to see the actual female crucifix image, and to see that she finally got installed where it first began. So, but along with that, I think this also shows a little bit about where we are in this moment with gender and imagery. I also had never seen the dinner party, the famous, iconic feminist, the dinner party with the plates of people who had been important but written out of history. And that is at the Brooklyn Museum. So if you ever go to Manhattan, you could do this all in one day if you're interested in it. So I started at St. John the Divine, saw Christa, saw the exhibit, but on the way, there was a new statue to see, and it was called Fearless Girl.
Yeah, at Wall Street.
Yeah.
Down the bull of Wall Street. She was all 3 feet tall, and the bull like goes up 6 feet. But what was amazing was that's where the pilgrimage was. There were all these tourists. Everybody was filing in to get their picture taken with Fearless Girl. And I thought, this is so interesting. At the dinner party, they were absent. Their plates, their work, their names, but there was no imagery. Then we get to the Christa image, which was to say, no, I'm here, and I've suffered. You need to look at me, and you need to recognize me. And today, we have now a fearless girl that will face down anything. And I thought it was a great snapshot of the moment of maybe where we're evolving into. And I would encourage churches to embrace that. I think that our younger generations are having the issues around this imagery the way older generations are. And if we want to be welcoming, we need to create ways to support pastors, because I wrote that those people that are on the worship on the altar are the real drill bits of the movement, because they are changing the ritual every Sunday in people's minds. So anything that we can do to support them, and that's why I wrote the book. But I think that there's a lot more a lot more space for today if people want.
And your comments about the fearless girl, we won't go too far afield on that, but there is now pushback to try to get that removed. So we're going to go through the same thing that Krista went through for a variety of reasons. But Marjorie, are you back with us?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, good.
Okay. Yeah,
So
I don't know where I went.
Yes, well, we know you're there, but we didn't hear you. But did you have any comment on Krista in terms of your teaching and that period?
Well, yeah. I found that the reactions were often ambivalent. On the one hand, it was a placing of a female body in a central Christian image that's been powerful and meaningful for millennia. On the other hand, I often observed a reaction of, no, just no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to climb up on the cross and suffer for everybody else anymore. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag, and so I want to go back to what Elizabeth said about a multiplicity of artistic images, of visual images. It seems to me that the key is ritual and art, because both ritual and art are capable of bearing multiple meanings simultaneously. And it is the nature of ritual and art not, I'm quoting Margaret Miles here, not to yield a detachable conclusion. You can never say with confidence, this is what that work of art means, or this is what that poem means, or this is what that ritual means. God knows we try, but the fact is, art and ritual don't work that way. And that's why it's so important to claim these spheres of art and ritual at the center of the church's identity, because that's where not only that's where the power is, but that's where the room is for all of these different reactions, all these different experiences, all these different needs, all these different goals can come together and interact with each other.
And I guess the question for me then is, again, out of our Christian experience, is can the church today be the container in which we have those multiple experiences of various images? And that it's okay to have multiple experiences. And
well,
not
it sort of doesn't
orthodoxy.
matter whether it's okay. People are having multiple experiences, whether it's okay or not.
True.
And these works of art and these rituals have room in them all the time for all of this. But as soon as we move them to the side and make dogma or creeds or theological statements the center, or laws, then that's where the problem comes in, it seems to me. Art and ritual hate laws.
But Marjorie, then you lose control.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's exactly what patriarchy fears.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And that's what women represent, is a loss of control.
All right. Let's let that move us to the next slide, Sarah. And we're gonna.
I'm kind of interested to hear
Please.
from Kathy what kind of creative liturgies, especially with her seminarians, if you're seeing any type of new imagery coming out of some of the new worship being created.
I think theological education is incredibly polarized. So yes, the seminary where I work, there's a lot of openness and kind of a laboratory attitude toward experimentation with lots of different kinds of diversity in terms of images, experience, and so forth. Listening to the conversation, I'm thinking about this centrality throughout history in different parts of the world of Mary as a beloved focus for prayer life. Or I took the goddess pilgrimage with Carol Christ. So I was in Crete and looking in Greece at the centrality of, in Eastern Orthodoxy, of those images of the female figure who is both Mary and wisdom, very multiple images there altogether. The challenge, of course, is that there are so many very repressive and controlling regions of ecclesiastical life. So sadly, in many, many, many communities, there's not much room for diversity.
You know, you said something that I want to highlight. One of the things that I discovered in looking across denominations, you know, having a background being Catholic, I found people coming out of Protestant traditions, especially in the research in this book, looking at the Sophia images or Mary images. Out of Eastern Orthodox would be where you'd see Sophia and you'd see Mary in Roman Catholic. And it was enlivening for Protestants to see that and to claim that as part of the tradition. But the Roman Catholic nuns had already, that Mary image had been so over-inscribed with so much of the patriarchal, seen and not heard, silent and suffering, all those kinds of things, that Sophia was the image they had to go to. So there are two things. One is, if you want to look for new imagery, I found that the groups really wanted to reach for images that hadn't been over dogmatized in their part of the Christian pond and be able to put the meaning on it, like the meaning that you put, Kathy, by going to Crete and seeing those images. So borrowing, I think there was very much mental and even interfaith that can lend a lot to this movement of being inspired by things that are ancient, that have inspired others. But in your particular part of how you practice your faith, you haven't seen much of it. So you can do the things that Marjorie's speaking about, which is to put your own imprint on it, take it in, drink it in the way that it's going to feed you. And then secondly, also, this goes back to even like what we just said about, you know, do we use the male imagery or not with abuse victims? You know, it's very particular. We also need to understand that in some quarters, the very imagery that for someone else that didn't grow up with that, it could be very liberating and inspiring. Somebody who might have had so much dogma put on it that they can't get those voices out of their heads in order to reinterpret the image, and they really need something new. I think that actually is why the Mary Magdalene figure became so hugely popular during the last quarter of the 20th century, because so many more stories could be written. There was a lot of space there.
Well, it sounds to me like you're describing, particularly in terms of the Mariology, the appropriation of Mary by patriarchy. And so then all of the, Mary then carries all of that, but from a patriarchal perspective. So being used to control women, but still include women in, you know, that they're, this image is for you. But we're going to tell you what the image is and what it means, and as long as it serves us, it's, you know, we're back to what I've always described as religion in service to patriarchy. So whatever our tradition and however we express it, it's never in and of itself when it's basically has been built around serving patriarchy, and that's part of what the you know, we work to try to break down and remove.
It has, and I would say that, like Kathy's experience, that like I've noticed in more modern Roman Catholic churches, that Joseph is getting much more play in the Holy Family images that are being created. And, you know, you have to go back to find the churches where it's all about Mary. But it was all about Mary at a time when it wasn't controversial to be all about Mary, at least as a Catholic. So I think what's wonderful about what Kathy did with the pilgrimage and what Carol does is that you can go to a more ancient time and you can use the imagery today in the way that it speaks. It may or may not have been put in place for that reason, but it doesn't take away, going back to what Marjorie said about the power of the image. We just have to be sensitive that certain people in their life experiences, if certain things were inscribed on them, that image may not be the liberating one. But if it hasn't been inscribed on you, I mean, it's amazing to walk into foreign countries. I mean, so Eastern Orthodox, my gosh, if you really want to see the feminine in Christianity, just go into any of the Eastern Orthodox churches that we have here in the United States. And if you're going to see the Sophia image over the whole altar, that's huge, the Mother of God image. It's amazing. But is that what the intent was when they painted it on the ceiling? I'm not so sure.
You mean you think the Holy Spirit might have snuck in there and helped with that effort?
Well, I think there's something about allowing our imagination and our spirit and prayer life to meet us when these images meet us. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and talk. I just want to touch on each of your chapters, and if there are any questions that any of you who have joined us want to raise around the specifics. In the first chapter, you're looking at the Methodist experience, particularly focusing on study of Sophia. One of my questions about that I simply don't know, so I wanted to go to you with this question, is in terms of those texts, what are Jewish scholars, what did Jewish scholars do with some of those texts? I'm just curious.
Well, so what we're talking about now is the scriptural portion, not necessarily the Methodist portion.
Yeah.
The Chokmah is more what, I mean, Jewish renewal, like where we see the feminine, similar in Christianity, it's going to be the more progressive branches of Judaism that are going to embrace more of the female imagery. They've always had the Shekinah, even in Deep Orthodox, and when that light enters, you are not to look at it because you're supposed to have your eyes covered because her presence and her radiance is so great. It's the light of God. So I don't hear so much about Chokmah. It does appear in the Kabbalah. Interesting, ends up on the male side of the tree of life, on the tree of wisdom, the Kabbalah tree. So the way the Christians pull on Sophia does not seem to be the way that I found the Jewish communities have taken on the imagery.
Yeah.
What's your experience, Marie?
I don't have any at this point, but I would like to. I'd like to have that dialogue. That would be, I think, an interesting conversation to have in terms of those original texts and where people have gone with them. So in terms of that first chapter, and that's where we hear about the Reimagining Conference, Kathy, that you referenced earlier. Any reflections and comments you all would like to make on this one?
I will just note Judith Plaskow's work related to the Jewish contemporary interpretation of some of those ancient texts. And I think her work has been very helpful to me in drawing some of those connections and seeing where Jewish feminist scholars are taking this. As far as the Reimagining Conference goes, it's a sadness to me that we can't seem to pull together a conference like that in this decade. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, why that is. Part of it, I think, is backlash to the Reimagining conference itself.
Still.
Yes, I think so.
You know, in terms of my research, I made a claim in the book, which I believe is, I mean, I back because I haven't seen anything against this, that this was the largest firing of professionally paid church women in the United States was after the Reimagining conference. As far as I can tell, it was over at least 100 women, which on the surface doesn't sound like a lot, but when you consider that we were dealing with only really the first wave of women getting paid to work in churches, and also getting into pastoral positions, it really did send a pall. As I did my research, people told me about book contracts being canceled, and it affected the whole academy. I would almost say the nadir of feminist theology kind of hit this like stall point in the 90s, but I think it started with the chill over the enactment and ritual, which blew back on the book contracts getting canceled, it becoming more controversial to be involved with it, and so people moved off into other things. And I echo Kathy's comment about it would be important to do this, more of this. I think it might come back in a new way because it's gender and sexuality, it's LGBTQ, it's intersectionality, it's with all the new language of. And one thing I find really interesting that I point out is that the Sophia figure is one of the few. If you follow Sophia into the second person of the Trinity, into Jesus, that's a trans image. And you know, that we don't have many in the Bible, but if you take it that way, there she is. The she wisdom that incarnates is the male Jesus. And hey, back in Yale Divinity, my New Testament scripture professor, she said the biggest claim about Jesus's divinity here is when it was incarnate wisdom. So, you know, there's a lot there that could be done if we have another conference like this.
Well, but then let's quickly reflect on the last chapter with her church and the conferences that they have tried to offer, and still there some of the pushback and some of the struggle of trying to have a conversation in that kind of a setting of these issues, and it's complicated.
It is complicated, and I think what's interesting, and now in my capacity as the task force chair at the Parliament for the Women's Programming for the next Parliament of World Religions, if you have, so the first time that her church did a conference on faith and feminism, they attracted a lot of Lutherans and a lot of Lutheran pastors speaking from those perspectives. And Christ being at the center of it, and the theology wasn't controversial. What was controversial was how far do you go with imagery and language, and what does that all mean? But the next year, by having Carol Christ come as a speaker, and she was wonderful, she attracted also, Kathy, I'm sure on her pilgrimage, was in a mixed group of goddess worshipers with Christian worshipers, and maybe spiritual but not religious, people that didn't really affiliate with anything. And that was kind of the population that came. And there, the imagery wasn't controversial. What was controversial was the theology. And I mentioned this in the book, that Carol's last lecture was her working through how you could take radical immanence into something of what is afterlife, how do you live past your life? And memory was her answer, meaning that Jesus is everlasting because we still remember him. But president of the council there, she stood up and said, you know, that's just not how I see things. And so the theology was kind of the difference. Yeah. So in terms of any gathering, I think it's to be very clear about why you're gathering, what you're gathering around. where the commonality is, and then where to leave space for the multiplicity of interpretations.
So, Marjorie, I'm curious, what was your experience of reimagining as you look back on it? Oh, we lost her again. Sorry.
So Marie, I just want to add in that there is a website called the Reimagining Community, which is basically set up as an archive. So I put a link to it in the PowerPoint, but there's all kinds of resources there. It's pretty great.
Great.
Thank you. Kathy, I would like to hear from you. What were the enduring things that have stayed with you all these years from that conference?
The multiplicity of voices represented in every presentation. One of the commitment to multiracial and multicultural inclusion was very central, although it didn't go as far as we all want it to, and so some of that critique of a white feminist kind of movement, I understand, but there was a lot of racial diversity with presenters, and so that modeled a kind of multiple voice authority rather than that ratcheting down on a focused control kind of orthodoxy. Of course, the embodied nature of the worship, the inclusion of art and image and all kinds of sensory experience. I remember Mary Hunt said afterwards something like, well, it was another really strong women's conference, because there were a lot of strong women's conferences then. It wasn't the first, it wasn't the only one that went that far, but it was a rich experience.
And I think a big piece of it was that it put ritual central, and that was that second firewall that groups were focused on.
But I think part of what was different that you lifted up there, Elizabeth, is the denominational connection and the fact that denominational money had been appropriated to support this, and then when it went the direction that it went for some people, that created a problem back in those denominational structures, and those women's staff, denominational bureaucrats who had made those commitments and were participants became the scapegoats for the backlash, and literally lost their jobs over the fact that they had participated. So it was one of the, I think, stark experiences of the institutional issues that we're still dealing with. And your point about book contracts and the cooling of the discussion in the academy and so forth, all of that is still, I think, part of where we are today, depending on, at this point in the denominations, there aren't any women's departments anymore. I mean, that's one of the things that's happened is, it's somewhat a matter of limited resources, but it's also where were the limited resources implemented, and the loss of women's staff in national denominational bodies in the Protestant world has been a huge issue, I think, and it has affected our work in the last 10 years. So that I think we're still dealing with the after effects of, that institutional response.
Interesting. Well, I can also tell you that working with graduate students there at the AR through the Women's Caucus, there is a hunger. You go to graduate school in part to find your voice, figure out who you are. And if you can't come to terms with gender issues, sexuality issues, all that, you can imagine that people want to do more study in that area. And we're going to be debuting a film at the AR in Boston in November called Forging Voice. And I'm very excited about this. We have a PhD student, Kate Comet, came in as a filmmaker to her doctoral program. And she wanted to record the voices of the first wave of feminist theologians. But as the projects developed, she and her co-producer, they're both graduate students, and what they're really sitting with is how to find their own voice. So they came out and they asked Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza and Rosemary Radford Ruther and the rest, how did you find your voice? Because something very innovative, very clear thinking, and very far-reaching were being said when that first corpus came out. And I'm finding it very exciting because there's a whole new wave, a new cohort that's emerging. I almost see myself as a transitional cohort, helping to bridge, but the group that's coming on board are on fire. And this film is very much about Kate trying to explore what is being called for her right now and other grad students to find their voice, to make the kind of statements that these women made 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Exciting. I'm looking forward to that. So let's go to the chapter 2 quickly to have a look at the Roman Catholic experience, the daughters' experience. And again, within the context of an institution that is explicitly and without apology male-dominated, male-controlled. I've sometimes felt like that for Roman Catholic feminists, the issues are so much clearer and than for Protestants, where the issues can get fuzzy in gray areas where you think we're making progress and no, we're not really, but it looks like we are because we ordain women or whatever. But for Catholic women, it's still pretty clear who's in charge and how they feel about all of these issues. So, what specific comments about this chapter?
Well, I would just like to, especially because of time, I just want everybody, the point of my book was to look at the 4 communities to find out how they were successful, and I identified 4 resources. So in the Methodist chapter, there were very strong Methodist leaders of worship. So when I talk about those drill bits who are on the altar, going to use their influence and ability to shape, even as Marie did with the Bible study. I mean, however it happens, to help the congregation move forward in that direction, it really does require some type of leadership. The Catholic nuns, it was about the internal personal experience. And I find it shocking that here we have, while religion is here to help you get closer to God, ultimately it's about you getting closer to God. And that's a very private, interior kind of experience, is a major part of it. Not that it doesn't get lived out, not that it doesn't get lived out in community and get affirmed and celebrated in community. But getting people to announce what their personal experience is to somebody else, especially if they have alternative images in there. It would be very interesting if we could go back to the woman that you met in that rural parish, Marie, to say maybe she didn't pay attention to that language at the altar, but when she was at home or said her prayers before she went to bed, I wonder how she prayed.
Right.
And when people pray differently, if they can share why they do it, either a personal story about violence or family systems are very powerful. And even if that's not your experience, you at least understand why they want it. And if you have any connection or love for them, you want to support them in that. It's a way to broaden the movement. The more people will talk about their personal experiences. Mm-hmm. And also, the more that we can encourage people in their private prayer life, whether your denomination is going to do this or not, there is space for you to do this. There's biblical scripture for you to draw upon to do this. Mm-hmm. I think that's important. And I think the daughters have done this very, very well. And they can't say certain language. They're not going to be ordained to do a mass, but certainly in prayer, certainly in art. And it's their personal experiences that have given them the courage to take the flag with this.
And in some ways, it sounds like they're they created that for themselves, parallel to, let's say, the Mass and the traditional patriarchal expression of Roman Catholic experience. So they're running alongside that, but what they created in terms of their own spirituality and focus on Sophia sounds much more meaningful and nurturing for them.
And it works for them, and they are excellent in allowing the diversity of perspectives and voices in their community not stop them from having community with themselves, as well as the priest order that they're affiliated with, the Montfortunes. So it's, it's a beautiful view of how to actually walk forward, say your truth, say how prayer happens for you, find a way that you can explain it to others, do it or not, and do it with being faithful with the denomination that you are vowed to.
Kathy, anything you want to add on this one?
I don't think so. Well said.
Yep. Okay, well, let's go to chapter 3. In some ways, I found this one most intriguing. I'm not quite sure why yet. I'm still thinking about that, but I could just see this whole thing.
Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, if I had a picture of her, I should have brought one down so I could hold it up. Anne Hepburn is so dear in my heart, and she passed away at the age of 90 last summer. And I love her. I love that I had the years I did with her. She was feisty to the end. That's all I could say. And sometimes God makes you she had just a bit, they said she was a real Scotswoman. They really appreciate feistiness in that land. Whether they agree with you or not, they do appreciate feistiness. And I did find that culturally, that was our one international chapter, to be a bit different than America. But I don't know if this is the reason, Marie, but in this chapter, it was a women's group that was against seeing this imagery, and they were the ones that were the most vocal. And I thought this was very interesting because the Women's Guild was about as high status a woman could go, to be a minister's wife and hold that kind of high status. And here Anne comes along, and she gets to be president of the organization, and then comes out with this prayer. And it was the rest of the ministers' wives that were so upset about it back in the 80s. Now, it did lead to a theological investigation. Of course, what we find out is that it's okay, but interesting, they couldn't get the panel to say that doing it in worship is mandated. They just said that it is available. And they do have a hymnal today that has 5 hymns with she language for God, all in the Holy Spirit section, but it's in there.
Yeah.
And, so there has been definitely some movement. I think the other thing that was interesting about this chapter is I got to speak with seminarians today, and they were open to the language. One thing is, Kathy, please keep up the good fight, because in all cases, it's almost like it's in seminary. If there's going to be a place to undo, or at least to broaden, I mean, there's so many ways to broaden someone called to pastoring, and it all has to happen in seminary because they've had the denominational experience until that point, and it's supposed to enrich and deepen. But most of them all said that they got their comeuppance when they were at seminary about what kind of language to use. So it's a good place for it to happen. What was interesting to me is that today, instead of the way that Stacy and the way her church does it in the 4th chapter is to be very kind of in your face and to make a statement about it, the new seminarians in the Church of Scotland, they want to include the imagery, but they wanted to make worship sense. So when they have a passage or when they're reading a psalm about something that they might interpret as feminine, compassion, mercy, something like this, then they want to use that imagery. But they don't want it to be kind of block, half this, half that, because they don't see that as being really helpful in a pastoral setting. And they also pointed out that they're really conflicted, even though they appreciate inclusive language. If you don't have somebody, again, this goes to what's happening with church attendance going down. If you only have somebody who shows up at Christmas and that's their only connection to the church, and this is a national church, so they have a broader kind of mandate than the other denominations I looked at. And the only thing that person knows how to sing is a Christmas hymn, and all of a sudden the language is different. You know, how welcoming is that? So, you know, the complexities of the reality today, I found interesting about the chapter.
Well, and you know, we could go so much deeper around the being the Women's Guild as the institutional setting in which this happened, and Hepburn as the leader of that group. So what had she gone through to become the leader of that group? And then in some ways she was the ideal person to bring this forward because she had credentials, traditional credentials, and yet the backlash was still, you know, so strong against her. And the whole issue of women's capacities to recognize their own self-interest and be able to live into that in a way that these women in the guild were not able to do. And, you know, on some level, we've just seen that in the U.S. elections in terms of women who bring themselves to a form of candidate. For all of us to I think explore around what is going on with this. How do we ever break out of you know, some of those expectations and the identification of self-interest in a very, very narrow sense. So that's part of what I appreciated about that chapter, is that it kind of laid that open for us to look at. Kathy, anything you want to add?
What a dramatic case study about the persistence of misogyny and, well, maybe just the fear of women. It's such a mild, you know, mother. It's such a mild example of more inclusive language. It can begin to be emancipatory, but wow, that's a crazy case study. Very interesting.
Yeah, you create that much havoc out of including mother as an image of God.
Yes,
yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think that what's interesting today is that the seminarians preferred in the Church of Scotland not to actually change the language in their worship hymnal, in their order of service, or in the Bible. What they wanted to do was put the inclusivity on the fly. And I include this in the book. I didn't believe them. I didn't think they could do it. And so they just started, you know, where it said brother, they'll say brother and sister. They didn't find that actually having to concretely change the text necessarily. They were the mediators through the oral tradition, which is interesting. It's like hydrating. It's the way we used to do it. It was old school that they're doing now in this manner, instead of fighting over. As long as there is that opportunity to breathe. I mean, some denominations are now saying you have to say things a certain way, but the Church of Scotland is allowing more flexibility.
And those seminarians are now going to be in positions where they have the capacity to provide that leadership, which is your point, particularly in the first chapter. So, okay, let's go to the fourth chapter before we close. So the resource of evangelization and the effort to build literally a church where I like the description of the mission was Christian feminism as part of the larger Lutheran expression in this particular part of the country.
Yeah.
But,
go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, there are two things. So the way the book is set up, I really meant it to be inspirational and a little bit of a how-to for any of you out there that would like to try some of this. The 4 resources, so I call it a strategic emplacement. First of all, expect that you're going to, at the very least, have confusion or bewilderment or a need of explanation. This church did a very good job of educating everybody in the congregation to understand why they're doing what they're doing, how it's tied in with the Bible as well as with Lutheran theology. There's expect education. This, I said, the resource of evangelization. The previous one, and if you noticed, I talked a lot about community. So in the first chapter, the Methodists were charismatic leaders. You definitely need somebody in terms of worship authority at a local parish level to say, let's move some of this forward. Number 2, you need some people who are willing to say to their friends or in informal ways or more formally, there are all these different ways I've experienced God. This isn't just an intellectual enterprise. This really happens in prayer life, and it's here in the Bible, and it would be very life-giving to include this as we worship as a community. So that's number 2. Number 3 is that you do need a community, and creating new worship forms and hearing Mark about it too, art and ritual. If you're going to do something new, it takes a lot of effort. And so the worship leader is going to need people who can write new music, do new ministries, paint, the altar guild, whatever it is. There's a whole explosion of creativity that needs to come forward to help express it as a community, plus help to make it more mainstream and as a center point for the community. This last one of evangelization, 2 points. One is that I think that having certain congregations within a denomination that are set up to be experimental, they are given the mandate to go as far as you can go with something, and then become a resource as they develop the worship resources that can be used by others in a more sporadic or occasional way. But I thought that was part of the power of what. And number 2 was this call to evangelize. The more people say you shouldn't do it, the more they be convinced that they needed to. In fact, the pastor, the parish council was trying to fire her, and they had a showdown, and it went on for 2 years. And it was only on the other side of that that she realized, and it was the issue for the parish because it was the thing that everybody was trying to fire her over. So that she kind of got pushed into it. People don't have to go through that kind of history to choose that, but just know, I think that's why the power of the gospel is so strong. Not that it has to lead to crucifixion by any stretch of the imagination, but if people realize that evangelizing means you're not going to be met with a lot of head nodding and a lot of hugs. You're going to get discomfort, you're going to get bewilderment, you're going to get misunderstanding. And when you're talking about the divine, back to what Marjorie said, it works on so many different levels, these images and these rituals, that we need to be compassionate. That for some people in a changing world, if the only thing that they have is certain scripture passages and certain images they have of Jesus, and that's going to carry them at the end of their life, then we need to really, really respect that too. So it's definitely a dance, but I thought they did a wonderful job, and everything that people threw at them to stop them just became another coal for the fire. We really need to do this. So just get ready and embrace it as the gospel journey.
It's a potent illustration of a process of change and pastoral leadership. Part of the reason I'm so grateful for this book, Elizabeth, your book, is this illustration of a process of adaptation and transformation. And so I wanted students to look at this as an example, even if they don't feel a strong calling to this particular kind of issue of emancipatory language and images for the divine. Still, what a wonderful example of introducing new ideas, reform, pushback, and then hanging in there. It's a courageous resistance story pretty inspiring.
Mm. Thank you, Kathy. And I want to add that in every one of these cases, it was an insider who was that charismatic leader.
Mm-hmm.
And you really need that. For something this radical, it's the person who was born into it, of the ethnicity that the denomination tends to be, who loves it so dearly that they want to really let it breathe and open it. Because it takes a lot of political nuance, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in how you talk to your great old uncle in a way to understand the new youngins. I mean, you have to love them, you have to understand the language of it, and you need to be that kind of person that can make the bridge and know when you can push and when it's appropriate not to. Because in all these cases, they were very nuanced in how they did this.
Right. And I think that's part of the value as well, particularly as a teaching text, Kathy, in terms of how you're using it. And the other part of this is using it as, this is what ministry looks like.
Yeah.
Okay, for students. This is, and again, as you said, it may not be your particular concern or priority, but this is what it looks like to be engaged in ministry at the grassroots level, and all of the things that in each chapter people learned from and strategically moved on, and so forth and so on. So that's where I'm wishing I had read this book when I was in Yale Divinity School as a student, and would have had a much clearer grasp of what was ahead in terms of how to do ministry.
Well, Marie, I want to say back to you that when I was at Yale Divinity, took a class that you authored on sexual misconduct of clergy that was mandated at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you definitely landed in a place and made big impact on me. I want to thank you for that.
Good. I'm not sure it's still mandated. I need to go back and worry about that some more, but for a moment, it was mandated in a lot of places. So
it's still mandated in our seminary too.
Well, that's because you're there, Kathy.
Well, no, that was true before I came here.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Good. So we need to conclude, and these are Elizabeth's final thoughts, which I think, Elizabeth, you've expressed so well for us tonight in your response to the discussion. I think that the other just brief story that I want to share in closing is when I was doing research for my book on sexual violence, one of the things I stumbled across was an anthropological study that didn't get much play as far as I know, because I never saw it again in any other setting. But it was a study where somebody was looking at various cultures, and when the author went into the culture that had been minimally impacted by outside culture. And they were trying to discern in the culture whether how particularly gender-based violence, and specifically rape, was understood by the members of the culture. And so they would go into that setting and describe rape, and then ask people, what you thought about this, or how did this happen for them, and what were the consequences, all that. And they found two settings in which, when they would do this, the people would look at them like they were from another planet and say, why would anyone want to do that to another person? They had no conception of sexual violence and that kind of exploitation of vulnerability in another person. And so the observation of the anthropologist, along with the whole study, but specifically about this, was the two things that they noticed that correlated with these two cultures was that their deities were both male and female, and their religious leaders of ritual were both male and female, and equally authoritative in terms of the life of the community. And as far as I'm concerned, for me, that's why this is such an important conversation, is because I think the patriarchal nature of our faith traditions has for too long undergirded the overt violence and the covert violence against women and children and marginalized men that we're all living with the consequences of. And if we are in any way a part of that in our faith traditions, then it behooves us to change that and to ensure that we are no longer a part, and in fact, that we're part of the healing that has created. So in that sense, I found your book extremely helpful, Elizabeth, and I just so appreciate your the effort that you made to take us into a place of, as Marjorie said, of historic importance, but also lessons learned that are immediately valuable today. And people like Kathy will continue to teach, hopefully for many years ahead in this area. So thank you both. And Marjorie, we lost, unfortunately, earlier. But thanks to all of you for your time and energy tonight, and blessings on your work as you go forward.
Well, thank you, Marie. And I would like to invite people, if they would like to help with this, I would love to do a library initiative and people have to request this at their local libraries. But it would be wonderful if we could have enough of these in public libraries that if anybody really just wanted to know, they could do an interlibrary loan and read these stories. That would make me so happy, and I'm so thrilled that Kathy's using the book at the seminary. I understand there are a couple in the United States that are, and I hope that more will do that. But I just want to show appreciation for you, Marie, and the work you're doing, and Kathy, the work you're doing, and that together, I do expect that things are going to continue. The world is going to be a better place because of the activities that you both are doing.
Likewise. And if you want to pursue the library initiative, Sarah will talk with you more about any way that Faith Trust can help let people know about that.
Okay, great.
We can talk offline.
Okay.
Okay, thank you again, and thank you to Sarah for all your help in getting us together. And we will be back in June. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so our next book is going to be a memoir by Dr. Monica Coleman, Bipolar Faith, which should be really fabulous. I can't wait to read that. So we will announce the dates for that. We're hoping June to have Monica join us.
Yep.
So thank
Okay.
you so much for being here, everybody. It was a fabulous conversation, and I just appreciate everything you do so much. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Sarah.
you.
Good night to
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.